All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. We got some really interesting source material, and we're going to dig in and pull out the stuff that's most useful and insightful for you,
Exactly. And this time around, we're diving into the world of lectures.
which might sound a little, I don't know, dry at first.
Yeah, you might be thinking lectures. Like, who needs those?
Right. But stick with us because it's actually going to be way more relevant than you might think, even if you're not a professor or a teacher.
Because we're not really just talking about standing up and talking at people for an hour. What we really want to unpack are the core principles behind effective lectures. Things like clear communication, how to keep people engaged, and how to make information stick in people's minds. And honestly, that's stuff that's incredibly useful for pretty much anyone, no matter what you do.
Totally agree. It's really about understanding how to transfer knowledge well and make things interesting and engaging, whether you're teaching, training, giving a presentation at work, or even just trying to explain something to a friend.
Right, all that good stuff. And our guide for this deep dive is a book called Dynamic Lecturing, Research-Based Strategies to Enhance Lecture Effectiveness.
Published in 2017 by Christine Harrington and Todd Skratzek.
Yes, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of making lectures work, which I think you'll find applies way beyond just the traditional lecture hall setting.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to figure out how lectures can be really effective learning experiences when they're done well. And by done well, we mean they're not just passive, one-way streams of information, but they actively involve the audience.
Right, and we'll see how combining those good lecturing techniques with smart strategies for getting people engaged can make a huge difference in how much people learn and retain.
Okay, let's get into it. So first things first, there's often this perception that lectures are, well, just not very effective.
Yeah, that lectures are boring and outdated and maybe even a little bit, well, bad.
Bad, yeah. Like the bad apple of teaching methods?
Right. Like we're stuck in the dark ages with these long, rambling talks. But the book actually makes a really interesting point right off the bat. They say that it's not lecturing itself that's inherently bad. What they call bad lecturing is the problem.
Okay, so it's about how you lecture, not the fact that you're lecturing at all.
Exactly. They even highlight a bunch of research showing that when lectures are done well, and especially when they're combined with what's called active learning, they can be really effective.
Like that study they mentioned from 2014 by Freeman and others.
Right. It was a big meta-analysis. They looked at tons of studies, and they found pretty clear evidence that mixing lectures with activities and engagement strategies can lead to much better learning outcomes than just straight up lecturing alone.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know I've definitely zoned out in plenty of lectures where I was just passively listening for too long.
Totally. But it's not just about keeping people awake, although that's important too, right? It's about making sure people are actually processing the information, connecting it to what they already know, and actively thinking about it.
And, thinking about it this way, it reminds me of this really vivid example from the book, the one about exploding chemicals.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. So imagine you're teaching someone about which chemicals are dangerous to mix together. I mean, that's pretty important stuff, right?
Right, like potentially life or death important.
Exactly. So in that kind of situation, just straight up telling the person, hey, don't mix these chemicals, it'll explode, directly transferring that crucial knowledge. That's not just the most effective way to do it. It's arguably the safest and most ethical approach.
Yeah, you're not going to have them discover that through trial and error.
Exactly. That could have some pretty explosive consequences.
Right. So that example really drives home the point that in some situations, especially when you're building that initial foundation of knowledge, like in a new field or with really critical information, just laying it out clearly in a lecture format can be absolutely essential. And it's often the best first step before you can even get to more hands-on, inquiry-based learning.
Yes. You need to understand the basics, the rules of the game, so to speak, before you can start experimenting and playing around with it. And lectures can be really effective at giving people that initial understanding.
So it's like, think of it as getting the basic vocabulary and grammar of a new language before you can have a full-blown conversation.
Exactly. It's providing that framework, that initial understanding so that you can build on it later.
So we've established that not all lectures are created equal. Some are definitely better than others. And the book actually talks about several different kinds of lectures, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Can you walk us through some of those?
Absolutely. So they start with kind of the classic traditional lecture format, the one we all probably picture when we hear the word lecture. Someone standing at a podium reading from a prepared paper.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah.
What do they have to say about that one?
So they point out that while this format can be okay for just delivering a lot of information in a short amount of time, it often lacks engagement and doesn't really tap into those higher level thinking skills we want to develop in learners.
Yeah, and it can get pretty monotone and boring if the speaker isn't super engaging and dynamic.
Hmm.
I mean, it's tough to stay focused when someone's just reading in a flat voice.
Right. And when the focus is so much on the written word, you also miss out on the richness of nonverbal communication, things like eye contact, gestures, and facial expressions. All those things that help to make a speaker more relatable and the information more engaging.
And it can feel really impersonal too, like there's
Yeah.
no real connection between the speaker and the audience.
Yeah, it can be a very one-way street of information.
Okay, so maybe not the most ideal lecture format in most cases. What are some of the other formats they discuss?
Well, one that they really highlight is the storytelling lecture. This one is all about using narratives and personal anecdotes to make the information more relatable and memorable.
That sounds way more interesting. I mean, we all love a good story, right?
Exactly. And they cite a bunch of research showing how effective storytelling can be in learning contexts.
Like that 2006 study by Cangelosi and Witt, I think it was.
Yes. They found that storytelling can help to capture attention, make complex concepts easier to understand, and even improve memory retention. And a lot of that has to do with the emotional connection that stories create.
Right, because when you're engaged with a story, you're not just passively taking in facts, you're actually experiencing it emotionally to some extent.
Exactly. You're putting yourself in the shoes of the characters, you're feeling their emotions, and that makes the information more meaningful and impactful.
I like how they bring in the actual science of emotions into this, like that thing called emotional contagion.
Oh, yeah. That's fascinating stuff. It's this idea explored by Barsad in 2016 that our emotions can actually be contagious, that we can kind of catch the emotions of the people around us.
So if a speaker's clearly passionate and enthusiastic about the topic they're talking about, that can actually make the audience more interested and engaged as well.
Exactly. It's like that energy is transferable. And they use TED Talks as a great example of this. Like a lot of TED Talks are essentially short lectures, but they're so engaging because the speakers are often telling stories, sharing personal experiences, and really conveying their passion for the topic.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about lectures that use a lot of visuals? That's so common nowadays, especially with things like PowerPoint.
Right. And the book calls those visually enhanced lectures. And those definitely have their place.
Because, I mean, we're visual creatures. A picture can really be worth 1,000 words, right?
It absolutely can. Visuals can help to clarify complex concepts, make abstract ideas more concrete, and even just make the lecture more visually appealing and engaging. And they mention research showing that when visuals are used effectively, they can lead to better learning outcomes.
Like a study from 2015 by Holstead.
Yeah, they found that using slides with mostly images, like charts, graphs, and diagrams, actually led to students doing better on tests and even rating the course and instructor more highly.
But they also caution against going overboard with the visuals, right?
Exactly. Too many visuals, especially if they're not directly relevant to the content or if they're overly flashy or distracting, can actually hinder learning.
Yeah, I've definitely been in lectures where the slides were like an assault on the senses, all these crazy animations and sound effects that really had nothing to do with what the person was talking about.
Right, and that actually goes back to some of those cognitive principles we talked about earlier. When you overload people with too much information at once, their working memory gets overwhelmed and they have a harder time processing anything effectively.
And they specifically mention a problem with slides that are just packed with text. Like they're basically just a transcript of what the speaker is saying.
Yeah, and that's bad for a few reasons. First, it's visually boring. Second, it forces people to split their attention between trying to read the slide and trying to listen to the speaker.
Which, like you were saying, is too much for our brains to handle at once.
Exactly. It's what Mayer called the redundancy principle in 2009. It's basically saying that when you present information both visually and auditorily in the exact same format, it's redundant and actually makes it harder to learn.
So keep the slides visually engaging, concise, and focused on the key points, and avoid just dumping a wall of text on them.
Precisely. Let the visuals enhance your words, not repeat them.
Okay, what about online lectures? That's become such a huge part of education in recent years, especially with the rise of things like massive open online courses, MOOCs.
Right, and the book dedicates a whole section to this. They point out that online lectures have some unique advantages. For one, they can be accessed by anyone, anywhere in the world, as long as they have an internet connection.
Which is great for making education more accessible to people who might not be able to attend traditional in-person lectures.
Exactly. And another big advantage is that they're often asynchronous, meaning people can watch them at their own pace and on their own schedule.
So you can pause, rewind, rewatch as many times as you need to.
Right. And a lot of online lectures also incorporate interactive elements like quizzes and discussion forums, which can help to increase engagement and learning.
But they also point out some potential downsides,
They
right?
do. One is that online lectures can sometimes feel less engaging than in-person ones. You're missing that face-to-face interaction, that energy of being in a room with other people.
And sometimes the technology itself can be a barrier. Like if the video quality is bad or the platform is clunky and hard to use, it can make it difficult to focus on the content.
Right. And it's super important to make sure online lectures are accessible to everyone, regardless of their abilities. Things like closed captioning and transcripts for people with hearing impairments are essential.
Okay, so there are definitely trade-offs to consider with online lectures. All right, let's dive into some of the key strategies the book outlines for making any kind of lecture, whether it's online or in person, more effective. The first one they talk about is activating prior knowledge. Can you explain what that means and why it's so important?
Absolutely. Activating prior knowledge is all about getting people to think about what they already know about a topic before you start throwing new information in them. It's kind of like warming up your brain.
Okay, so it's like stretching before you exercise. You don't just jump right into the most intense workout.
Exactly. You need to prepare your brain to learn, just like you need to prepare your body to exercise.
And how does this help with learning?
Well, think of your brain like a giant filing cabinet. When you learn something new, you're essentially creating a new file folder and putting information in it. But if you don't have any related files already in your cabinet, it's harder to make sense of the new information.
Because it's just floating around in there with no context.
Exactly. But when you activate prior knowledge, you're basically pulling out all those related files and putting them on the table. So when the new information comes in, your brain can immediately connect it to what it already knows, which makes it easier to understand and remember.
So it's all about making those connections, those neural pathways.
Exactly. And they mention a really cool study from 2014 by Van Kesteren and others that actually looked at what happens in the brain when we activate prior knowledge.
Oh, tell me about that.
So they used brain imaging, and they found that when people were learning new information that was related to what they already knew, their brains actually processed the information more efficiently.
So their brains weren't working as hard.
In a way, yes. It was like their brains were able to take shortcuts because they already had a foundation to build on.
Okay, that's super fascinating. But from a practical standpoint, how can instructors actually do this? How can they activate prior knowledge in their lectures?
Well, the book gives a bunch of great strategies. One is to use pretests. And these aren't necessarily for a grade, but more just to gauge what students already know about the topic.
And to identify any misconceptions they might have, right?
Exactly. And even the act of taking a pretest can help to activate prior knowledge. It gets students thinking about the topic and trying to recall what they might already know.
Oh, yeah, I remember doing those in some of my classes. It's kind of like a little mental warm-up.
Right. And then the instructor can use the results of the pretest to tailor their lecture and make sure they're addressing any knowledge gaps or misconceptions.
And they emphasize that this is especially useful in courses where there are prerequisites to make sure everyone's on the same page, at least in terms of those basic concepts.
Definitely. Another really effective strategy is to use quick quizzes or polls at the start of class or before introducing a new topic.
Like those in-class polling apps where you can answer questions on your phone or laptop.
Exactly. Tools like Poll Everywhere or Kahoots can make this really engaging and fun, but you can also do it low-tech, like just asking for a show of hands or using colored index cards.
I like that they include those low-tech options because not everyone has access to the latest technology, and sometimes the simplest methods are the best.
Totally agree. And then there's this really cool technique they call dusting off the cobwebs.
That's a great name.
Right. It's basically a way to get students to reactivate knowledge from previous classes or readings. So they might pair up with a partner and try to recall key concepts without looking at their notes first. And then they can refer to their notes to fill in any gaps.
So it's forcing them to actually retrieve the information from memory, which, as we were talking about with the testing effect, is so important for learning.
Exactly. And then the instructor can lead a quick review with the whole class, randomly calling on students to share a concept they remember.
And that helps to make sure everyone's paying attention and participating, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And it gives the instructor a good sense of how well the class is understanding the material.
It's like a built-in check for understanding.
Exactly. And they suggest doing this maybe once a week to keep those key concepts fresh in everyone's minds. And then the last strategy they talk about for activating prior knowledge is using think, pair, share, but with a specific focus on connecting personal experiences to the new content.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you explain how that works?
So the instructor might introduce a new topic or concept and then ask students to think about any personal experiences they've had that relate to that topic. Then they pair up with a classmate and share those experiences and discuss how they might connect to what they're learning. And then finally, some of the pairs might share their thoughts with the whole class.
And the instructor's role in this is to really guide those connections and help students see how their own experiences relate to the bigger picture of what they're learning.
Precisely. It's all about making those connections and helping students see the relevance of the material to their own lives.
So it's not just abstract knowledge anymore. It's something they can connect with on a personal level.
Exactly. All right, so once you've got that prior knowledge activated, the next big challenge is keeping people's attention, which, let's be honest, can be tough in any lecture setting.
Especially nowadays. I mean, we're also used to being constantly bombarded with information and distractions.
It's a huge challenge. Our brains are literally wired to seek out novelty and stimulation. So sitting still and focusing on one thing for an extended period of time can be really difficult, even when the topic is interesting.
Yeah, and the book actually talks about the science behind this, like how our brains release dopamine, this feel-good chemical, when we experience something new or exciting.
Right. So when we're constantly switching between tasks, checking our phones, browsing social media,
Right.
our brains are getting these little dopamine hits.
And that makes it even harder to focus on something that's not providing that same level of instant gratification.
Exactly. And all this multitasking has a real impact on learning. The book cites several studies showing that students who multitask during lectures tend to have lower grades and perform worse on tests. And it's not just hurting their own learning either.
What do you mean?
Well, some research has shown that when one student is multitasking, it can actually negatively affect the learning of the students around them.
Oh, wow. I hadn't really thought about that, but it makes sense. If you're distracted, you're more likely to distract other people.
Yeah, exactly. So what can instructors do to try and combat this epidemic of distraction?
Yeah, because you can't exactly confiscate everyone's phones.
Right. The book suggests a multi-pronged approach. So first, it's important to establish clear expectations and classroom policies around technology use from the very beginning.
Like having a conversation with the class about why it's important to create a focused learning environment.
Exactly. And framing those policies in a positive way, focusing on the value of focused attention rather than just saying no phones.
Right, because nobody likes to be told what they can't do.
Exactly. And then, when you do see off-task behavior, the book recommends starting with subtle, nonverbal cues.
Like moving closer to the student who's on their phone or making eye contact with them.
Exactly. Sometimes that's all it takes. But if the behavior persists, you might try incorporating the student's name into an example you're giving, rather than directly calling them out.
Oh, that's a good tactic.
Yes.
Acknowledges them without making them feel embarrassed or singled out.
Right. And if you really need to address it directly, a quiet one-on-one conversation outside of class is probably more effective than making a scene in front of everyone.
And they also suggest having a frank discussion with the class about the science behind multitasking and how it can actually hinder learning.
Right, because sometimes students just aren't aware of the impact it's having both on their own learning and on the learning of their classmates.
Yeah, we need to educate people about how their brains actually work.
Exactly. Now, even with the best intentions and the most engaging content, there's a limit to how long anyone can realistically pay attention in a lecture setting.
Yeah, our brains just weren't designed to sit still and passively absorb information for hours on end.
Right. So the book recommends breaking up longer lectures into shorter segments, maybe around 15-20 minutes each, and following each segment with a brief, active learning exercise.
So give people a chance to move around, talk to each other, process the information in a different way.
Exactly. And there's research to support this approach. Studies have shown that these shorter, more interactive lectures can lead to better learning outcomes and higher student satisfaction.
It makes sense. I know when I'm in a long lecture, my mind starts to wander after a while. But if there's a break or an activity to refocus my attention, it's much easier to stay engaged.
Right. You're basically giving your brain a little mental break and a chance to recharge.
What about note-taking? Because sometimes that can actually be a distraction itself, especially if students are frantically trying to write down every word.
That's a great point. And the book offers some helpful advice here, too. One strategy is to provide students with some kind of organizational structure for their notes, like making PowerPoint slides available beforehand or using guided notes.
I remember having guided notes in some of my classes. It was like a fill-in-the-blanks outline that went along with the lecture.
Exactly. And that can be really helpful because it gives students a framework to work with and frees up their mental energy to focus on the actual content of the lecture.
But they're very clear that slides should be used to enhance the lecture, not replace it.
Absolutely. And they emphasize the importance of signaling important points during the lecture.
Like saying things like, this is really important, or make sure you write this down.
Exactly. And even just changing your tone of voice or using more emphatic gestures can help to signal that something is key.
So it's like you're giving students verbal and nonverbal cues to guide their note-taking.
Precisely. All right, let's move on to another really important aspect of effective lecturing in the digital age: how to use multimedia and technology wisely.
Because it can be a great tool for learning, but it can also be a huge distraction if it's not used thoughtfully.
Exactly. And the book really stresses that just using technology for the sake of using technology doesn't automatically make a lecture better. In fact, it can often make things worse.
Yeah, like if the technology is clunky and difficult to use, or if it's just distracting and takes away from the learning.
Exactly. The key is to use technology in a way that supports learning goals, not just for the sake of being flashy or high-tech. And they bring back those core principles of cognitive psychology we were talking about earlier: the importance of managing cognitive load, minimizing distractions, and presenting information in a way that makes sense to the brain.
So less is more when it comes to slides.
Definitely. They reiterate that coherence principle we discussed: extraneous information can distract, and they remind us of that modality principle, the idea that people learn better when information is presented both visually and auditorily, but in a way that doesn't overload either channel.
So you wouldn't want to have a slide packed with text and then also be talking about something completely different at the same time.
Exactly. That would just confuse the brain. Instead, you might have a slide with a simple image or diagram, and then use your words to explain the concept in more detail.
Okay, that makes sense. What about using things like polling tools and social media in lectures? The book talks about those as well.
Yes. They see a lot of potential in those tools for increasing engagement and interaction. Like, polling tools can be used for quick quizzes, checking for understanding, and even gathering real-time feedback from the class.
And social media platforms like Twitter can be used for things like back-channeling, where students can post questions or comments during the lecture that might not feel comfortable asking out loud.
Right, but they also caution against the potential for distraction with these tools. It's important to set clear expectations and guidelines for how they should be used, and to make sure everyone is using them for learning purposes, not just for socializing or entertainment.
And they also give some practical tips for designing effective slides.
Right. Yes. They recommend using simple language, keeping the design clean and uncluttered, and choosing readable fonts. And they emphasize the importance of consistency, using the same font and background throughout the presentation to avoid visual distractions.
And using images and graphics strategically to enhance the message, not just as decoration.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to another incredibly important aspect of effective lecturing: the power of examples.
Because a good example can really make a concept come alive, right? And take something abstract and make it concrete and relatable.
Absolutely. And they talk about how examples tap into that idea of prior knowledge we were discussing earlier. When you use an example that's relevant to your audience's experience, you're helping them connect the new information to something they already understand.
It's like building a bridge between the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Exactly. And they go even deeper than that, talking about how examples actually strengthen neural pathways in the brain. Like, the more times you encounter a concept in different contexts and with different examples, the more ingrained that concept becomes in your memory.
And they specifically highlight the value of using case studies as a particular type of example.
Yes. They say case studies are especially effective for showing how theoretical concepts play out in real-world situations.
Because it's one thing to understand a concept in the abstract, but it's another thing entirely to see how it's actually applied in a real-world scenario.
Right. And case studies can also be really engaging because they often involve stories, conflicts, and resolutions, all those elements that naturally draw us in.
And they emphasize the importance of instructors providing some initial examples before asking students to generate their own.
Yes, because sometimes you need to show people how it's done before you can expect them to do it themselves. It's like giving them a model to work with.
Okay, so what are some practical ways to incorporate examples into lectures?
Well, one simple but effective technique is to just pause during the lecture and give students a few minutes to think about their own examples related to the topic you're discussing.
So make it interactive. Get them thinking.
Exactly. You can also use think, pair, share activities specifically focused on generating examples. Like, you might ask students to come up with an example of a time when they experienced a particular psychological phenomenon, or to think of a real-world example of a scientific principle in action.
And then they discuss their examples with a partner and maybe share some with the whole class.
Right. And another idea is to have students complete example tables at the end of a class where they list the main concepts covered and then come up with a corresponding example for each one.
So it's like a little review activity that forces them to apply what they've learned.
Exactly. Okay, let's talk about the importance of encouraging reflection in lectures. This one might seem small, but it's actually incredibly powerful.
Because it's all about taking a step back and really processing the information, right? Not just passively absorbing it.
Exactly. And they bring in research showing that reflection helps to increase what's called cognitive engagement, which basically means you're actively thinking about and making sense of the information.
And the more cognitively engaged you are, the more likely you are to actually learn and retain the information.
Precisely. And reflection also helps to develop critical thinking skills. It encourages you to question assumptions, consider different perspectives, and make connections between ideas.
And they emphasize that it doesn't have to take up a lot of time. Even short reflection breaks can be really beneficial.
Absolutely. One strategy they suggest is simply pausing during the lecture for a minute or two and giving students a chance to reflect on what they've just heard. Like, you might ask them to think about a question you've posed or to jot down any key takeaways.
And you can also use those 1-minute papers we talked about earlier.
Yes. Those are great for getting a quick pulse check on student understanding and for identifying any areas that might need further clarification.
And they really stress the importance of asking thought-provoking questions that go beyond just simple recall.
Exactly. Like, instead of just asking, what are the three main types of memory, you might ask, how do the different types of memory work together to influence our everyday experiences?
So questions that really get students thinking critically and making connections.
Precisely. And they also talk about using reflective journals, where students write regularly about their learning process and their progress.
And those can be a great way for students to monitor their own learning and identify areas where they might need to focus more attention.
And they can be really helpful for the instructor, too, because they provide insights into how students are thinking and what they're struggling with.
All right, let's tackle what's arguably one of the most important principles of effective learning: retrieval practice, or, as it's also known, the testing effect.
Right. And this is such a cool concept because it basically says that the act of trying to recall information from memory actually makes that information stronger in your mind.
So it's like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. And they even use that analogy in the book. They talk about how retrieving information from memory is like walking a path through tall grass. The more times you walk that path, the clearer and more defined it becomes. And eventually, it becomes so well-worn that you can easily follow it even if you haven't been there in a while.
And they highlight a really important study by Roediger and Karpikit from 2006 that really showed how powerful the testing effect can be.
Yeah, that's a classic study. They had students study a passage of text, and then they had some students just reread the text multiple times, while other students studied it once and then took a test on it.
And what did they find?
Well, the students who took the test actually performed much better on a later test that was given a week later, even though they studied the material less overall.
So it's not just about how much time you spend studying, it's about how you study.
Exactly. Actively trying to retrieve information from memory is much more effective than just passively rereading it.
And they talk about how this relates to that idea of the illusion of competence.
Right. When we just reread something, it feels familiar, so we think we know it. But that familiarity can be deceiving. We might be able to recognize the information if we see it again, but we might not actually be able to recall it from memory.
So it's like tricking yourself into thinking you know something when you really don't.
Exactly. And that's why retrieval practice is so important. It forces you to confront your actual level of understanding and identify any gaps in your knowledge.
So how can instructors incorporate more retrieval practice into their lectures and learning activities?
They give a bunch of great strategies. One is to simply ask more questions during the lecture and give students a chance to answer them, either individually or in groups.
So make it more interactive and less like a one-way information dump.
Exactly. And they also suggest incorporating more low-stakes quizzes throughout the course rather than just having a few big exams.
Because the more opportunities students have to retrieve information from memory, the better they'll learn it.
Right. And they can use all sorts of tools for this, like clickers, online quizzing platforms, even just simple index cards.
And they also talk about the value of encouraging students to create and use flashcards.
Yes. Flashcards are a classic retrieval practice tool, and they're really effective. But they do caution against discarding flashcards too soon.
Because even if you think you've mastered a concept, it's important to keep reviewing it periodically to make sure it stays in your long-term memory.
Exactly. Use it or lose it.
All right, let's move on to another crucial aspect of effective lecturing, the art of asking good questions.
Because not all questions are created equal. Some questions just require you to recall basic facts, while others really make you think deeply and critically about the material.
And they talk about this in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, right?
Yes. Bloom's taxonomy is a framework for categorizing different levels of thinking skills, from the most basic level of remembering facts to the highest level of evaluating and creating.
And they argue that instructors should strive to ask more of those higher-level questions that require students to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate information.
Exactly, because those are the kinds of questions that really promote deep learning and understanding.
And they highlight a particular type of questioning called Socratic questioning.
Yes. Socratic questioning is all about asking a series of probing questions to guide students' thinking and help them arrive at a deeper understanding of a concept.
So it's less about the instructor providing all the answers and more about helping students discover the answers for themselves.
Exactly. It's a very inquiry-based approach to learning.
And they also talk about the importance of wait time, that period of silence after you ask a question.
Yes, research has shown that increasing wait time, even by just a few seconds, can lead to more students participating in discussions and giving more thoughtful and elaborate answers.
Because it gives them time to actually process the question and formulate a response, rather than just blurting out the first thing that comes to mind.
Right. And they even suggest having students write down their answers before sharing them with the class, which can also help to improve the quality of responses.
And they also touch on the somewhat controversial practice of cold calling on students who haven't volunteered to answer it.